Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us on Getting Back to Business. This is our HR resource session of a three-part series. So the first of our three-part series in our multi-chamber and Spark initiative here. And we're excited to help you chart your path forward. I'm Janelle Best with the Howell Area Chamber of Commerce, and we know that restrictions are taking a positive direction, we hope, and hopefully it'll stay that way. But right now I'm just gonna hand it over to Katie to give a quick introduction of herself. And Katie, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Thanks, Janelle. I appreciate that. I just want to welcome everybody to today's webinar series. It's been really great collaborating with Ann Arbor Spark and the Howell and the Brighton Chamber to bring you these great tools and resources for your business. You know, power and numbers, stick together, and be a part of the solution is kind of, you know, our attitude. So, and we're really thankful for our presenters that have jumped on board to help the area businesses with this webinar series. So, and we can go over the details, Janelle, if you don't mind at the end, we'll go over the details of the webinar series, what the next ones are, and also the Q&A, I don't want to say protocol or, you know, rules or whatever for today's webinar. So thanks. And I guess I'll turn it over to Pam.
Hi, I'm Pam with the Brighton Chamber of Commerce, and we're glad that you're participating again. We hope that you have found these to be worthwhile. I think we have a good little mini series coming up, beginning with today with Steve. And if there are other needs that you have, be sure to let us know, because we do enjoy this collaboration. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Pam. Thanks, Katie. And Marcia, did you have anything that you wanted to add today?
Nothing too much to add. I hope everybody's having a great week so far, and we look forward to continuing to bring resources to all of our businesses in Livingston County. We are here to serve everybody.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you, Pam and Katie. These collaborations have been great. So as Katie mentioned, the Q&A portion of this will occur after Steve is finished with his presentation. Make sure that you are using the Q&A feature on Zoom. We'll read the questions out loud, and Steve will provide an answer. We did have a few questions that were submitted ahead of time, so we'll address those first and then jump into our live Q&A. And without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Steve Williams. He is with the president of Ecto HR. He has about 19 years in the human resource industry as a graduate of the University of Michigan, and has experience in all areas of hiring and the employment process. So he is here today to talk to us a little bit about getting your plan ready, back in action to provide a safe workplace, or as safe as possible workplace for your employees as we start returning back to work. So Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you with us, and we're looking forward to charting our path forward.
Thanks, Janelle. Appreciate that. Certainly thank you to Pam, to Marcia, to Katie, and Janelle, and all the chambers. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started here. And if I could just get a head nod from our co-panelists that we're good with the shared screen. Thanks. So
yep.
We've got, I've got quite a bit of content we want to cover today. And certainly those of you that know me know that I can talk kind of fast. And so I want to start with disclaimers and jump into our actual material here. Certainly want to leave time for some Q&A at the end. And then certainly if we don't get to your Q&A at the end, if you can chat it in, we'll then write some responses. We've also got some documents today that we would be more than glad from Ecto to share those with you. So with that, we'll jump in since we're on a fairly tight time frame to cover this and get going. Just a couple other disclaimers here. I do appreciate the chambers and their willingness to provide information. It's been great to get all that information and to see them working together. I think it speaks to why Livingston County is a great place to live and do business. I don't speak directly on behalf of the chambers or Ann Arbor Spark. I mentioned that, so if I say anything outlandish, don't hold it against these ladies and their organizations today. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not here providing legal advice, and I'm not necessarily we're not at Ecto pandemic experts. I would say that over the last 8 weeks, as we really rewind the tape to the beginning of March, we have spent as a team of 10 so much time with our 60 plus organizations or clients, so much time researching, and I know so many of you have, researching and reading and digesting information and really trying to get a handle on things and understand as things change, how we can implement policies, procedures, how it's going to impact our businesses and our lives. So the one thing I'm grateful for as we sit here on April 28th is that the news cycle and the information has finally slowed down. It felt like in those first 2 weeks that if you left your computer for 2 hours, you missed an entire news cycle and things had changed, and it was really overwhelming. So we're going to try to share with you what we've seen work with our clients, some of those who are essential and have been working this whole time, and some who are ramping up either now based on some exceptions to the executive order or preparing to ramp up, what we've seen work. And just understand that what we're sharing with you today is about what we know today, and that's certainly different from a week ago prior to the governor updating the executive order. That's different than 4 weeks ago. And all of us, I think, the one message I'd give to all of you, what we've tried is really just to do our best, make a good faith effort to understand all of this information and to implement it in as fair a way as possible. So with that, let's just look at what our agenda and what we have planned here. We want to talk a little bit briefly about putting together a team and who within your organization really is going to lead your response. And even though it is April 28th and we're looking at hopefully a broad return to business over the next couple of weeks heading into May 15th, it's not too late for that. The best practices for communication are some of our recommendations or thoughts around a phased approach to, we put RTO here, but returning to work or returning to the office, ramping back up, doing both a worker and a workplace assessment to understand where your real risks are. Certainly understanding the value, and not only the value, but the real requirement to do employee and visitor screening for symptoms. Some of the personal protective equipment or PPE that you need to provide and make available. That's changed even in the last week as it relates to providing face coverings, for example. I have mine somewhere on my desk. I'll pull it out later. But some general hygiene and disinfecting policies. I think most people are up to speed on this. We won't spend a lot of time on it. Jumping into what to do when an employee is sick or experiences symptoms at work, or we have a known person who's tested positive for COVID. We've seen that within our client base, and we've seen some of the positive ways to address it. And unfortunately, early on with one of our clients, we saw what a slow reaction time will do and the impact that's had on both their workplace and their business, but really on their employees and the response. We'll talk about some other factors, certainly for all of you to think about, other policies and procedures. And then I know we've gotten a lot of questions about recalling employees to work. And one of our questions came in was about that specifically, and how do we motivate and get people back to work when, for the first time in at least my 20-year career, people can and are making as much or more on unemployment potentially. And certainly that's something to think about. I don't know that it's as big of a deal as it's getting attention for, but we'll talk about best practices around that. And then we'll just share some additional resources and things we're monitoring where we're able to pull information and share information, and then certainly time for Q&A. So with that, we'll jump in and talk about some of the actual content here. And I just put this here. I know it seems like a no-brainer, but it's really surprising how many organizations haven't really maintained consistent communication with their teams throughout this. And I think some of that comes from a lack of knowledge about what to do, and their feeling is, I don't know what to say, or I don't know what kind of time frame. A lot of people feel like they're holding their breath, awaiting the governor's next announcement, or potentially the president's next announcement. And so they haven't communicated, but it's not too late. I would mention that right away. It's not too late to start regular and consistent communication, setting a cadence. The best practice we've seen, we have a client that holds a call every single Friday at 3:30, whether they need it or not. They've been as long as 45 minutes, and they've been as short as 15 minutes. But we've gotten great feedback from that in terms of staying in touch with people. So I won't spend much more time on that. It's just not too late yet. And the next piece is, as we think about who's leading your response and who's really building your plan as we get back to business and we start to reopen either entire businesses or phases or departments. who's responsible and who have you put in place to help you make those decisions? And I make this joke kind of in jest, but it's not just the old white guys in the room that you see here. I think it's really critical that we get a really solid cross section of employees. We don't need a team of 20 people, but if we've got an organization that has 30 or 40 employees, I would certainly recommend, and we would recommend to you, that you include people at different levels and within different roles within your organization. If you're a multi-location, multi-site employer, including someone from each of those because they give a different perspective. An example I give is the person that sits in the reception or front desk is such an invaluable piece because they're really on the front line of the visitors, the door opening, and things we may not think about. We had a couple visitors here today and the door was locked. And so I needed to open the door and those two gentlemen came kind of, I hope they're not on this call, kind of came barging right in, right? And so having not had a lot of visitors to the office when I've been here by myself, it was a different perspective, right? So, and then, just kind of describing or documenting what each person's role is within that, who's responsible for communicating. Ultimately, and we'll talk about this, who are our health screeners? Who are we going to channel information to within our organization as the keepers of the information that will keep it confidential, but also be in a position to be able to react quickly. The other point I'd mention here is who's responsible for approving exceptions or making changes. So certainly we're going to set certain policies as we get back into business full scale. And there are going to be exceptions to those policies, and who is responsible for actually approving those and getting some clarity around that. And just going back to the communication piece, I was talking to Corey Fernandez of Humanergy, who does some work with us, and he reminded me about leading with your values. And so we've seen organizations who have transparency as a value, and yet they're not communicating, or safety is their number one, yet they haven't shared with employees how they're going to make a best effort to keep them safe. So leading with your values. And the last point here is sharing about the process for arriving at the decisions, I think is a best practice. And we've seen great value from this, not just sharing what you decided and when you're going to recall people, but sharing who was involved in the decision, how you arrived at the decision, why you arrived at a decision to recall either a whole group of people or only maybe 50%. Because I think the more you share about how you arrived at the decisions and who was involved, the better buy-in you get. And you'll also create this two-way communication where you'll get really good feedback from your team, who often knows more than we might or I might sitting here. So I think that, a lot of employers are really concerned with how do I get my team comfortable and feeling confident about returning to work, not just financially, but really from a risk perspective and thinking about the emotional side of coming back to work with all the different dynamics. And I think the way to do that is to communicate, and to communicate how and why. If you want to show people that you value them and safety is most important, really demonstrate that through your decision making. So the next piece here is really around building a phased approach. And I think a lot of people are chomping at the bit really for a lot of reasons, and a lot of really good reasons. A lot of driven entrepreneurs, business owners, a lot of people for whom business has been severely impacted, and they're really chomping at the bit to get going. And yet I still think a phased approach is probably the best one, right? And we're not asking people to predict the future. If any of us could have done that, we'd be, multi-millionaires at this point and wouldn't be in the same position we're in now. But really just to simplify this as you think about it and break it down into what period of time am I comfortable sort of committing to, and how do I break that into phases? So for us in our office, and I'll just mention the way we're approaching it, is we're really looking at 2-week increments. Early on, it was a matter of days, but we're kind of biting off. If we're making some assumptions about May 15th, getting some broader reopening, and we know this week we'll have some reopening in certain sectors, construction, and I don't know if anybody else noticed yesterday, I saw the landscaping trucks all over the place yesterday, and gals out working, and it was really great to see. It was a beautiful day, right? I think there's more optimism yesterday than the day prior. But really, let's break this down into couple-week increments and just be able to say to people, here's how we're going to start, and we're going to start incrementally. And in addition to that, we know we're going to be in this phase for at least 2 weeks. It could be longer. It's not going to be shorter. And then we set a time frame, so for us, we're going to really begin to open our office up a little more, assuming we get a return to work. So that Monday, the 18th of May, looks like a likely date for us again. So, and we're going to stagger our teams and not have everybody in on day one, have about half. We're not going to have people in shared offices in together on those days, but we've committed to people that that's going to carry us at least through the end of May, right? And so they can plan their lives around that a little bit. I think the one fallback I'll mention here, as we've seen from some employers, is they lose sight of the fact that we are in the most challenging time we've ever experienced as it relates to childcare, as it relates to home structure, home life, people working at home. And so we had an employer, someone close to me, who the employer just texted everyone and said, we're back to work on Monday, whatever the 4th is. That was it. We have a full schedule. We're back to work, nothing else. And it caused a mutiny, right? Versus a verbal conversation and a plan is, here's our first steps. Here's how we're going to keep you safe. So I think asking those questions like, who is critically necessary to be in your office or in your workspace? And certainly this is very different if you're a largely office-based employer, which, according to the presentation yesterday from the governor and her team, is about 20% of the overall, a little north of that. But if you are in a food service or in a retail environment, more people's physical presence in person is required to serve your customers. You've got a little different dynamic, right? And so we have to think about that. And I would just say setting the minimum amount of people that need to be there to be successful. You can always add more later, and it's easier to begin to call more people back than it is to bring them all back and realize it doesn't feel like you can do it safely, and then walk that back. So, so looking at this, I think it's about, as we begin this phased approach and really think about it, is you really have to do this worker and workplace assessment and really get an understanding within your team what the real risks are. And so this isn't Ecto's information. This is from the best practices, right? And understanding with your people, are they interacting with the general public all day? Do they have frequent contact with coworkers? I think about the chamber in their office settings or home office, they may be able to avoid frequent in-person contact. Now, you certainly can't hold a big community event and do that. If we've got production people and they're working more than 6 feet away, and then they occasionally have to slide within that 3 to 6 feet, that's a different dynamic than if we think about people finishing concrete, for example, or even people preparing food. If we think about a fast service, a quick service restaurant where they're all working at a counter and they're very close to each other, that's a different dynamic, and that shapes the way we, and there may be no fix for that except for PPE, which we're going to talk about, right? Workplace characteristics, indoor, which is higher risk, right, versus outdoor. More ventilation, airflow lowers the risk, and worker density and the number of workers absolutely has a huge impact. I saw an interesting note that Volkswagen in Germany is reopening one of their largest plants, and typically they would have 20,000 workers staffing that across 3 shifts, and they're coming back with 8,000. And just as a frame of reference, they have over 100 new policies and procedures that people will be observing in their daily life. So I hope we don't have 100 new policies for everybody participating today, but we certainly have at least 10 and more than that, right? And you don't have to be a medical doctor to understand what some of those are, or an HR professional or a safety person. I think the other piece here is understanding some of your worker demographics and health and age. And certainly it doesn't mean that we take a cavalier approach, but if we have predominantly young people working in an outdoor environment with spacing, that's different than some of our production or manufacturing clients that have a higher average age. The workers may be more sedentary, they may have higher risk factors, they may be working closely together. Transportation to work is something in Livingston County. I think we have a smaller percentage of employees overall that are using public transportation or shared transportation, but this still does create risk in the event we have an outbreak or we have cross-contamination is that it makes contact tracing harder and it potentially increases our exposure. So there's a lot of things to think about. Certainly thinking about common areas and what you have there. And so I show a picture here. This is our downstairs. I think Sandy's on. That's First Impressions work. A little plug for them on that back wall. That's a little brainchild of theirs. But so we can typically put a lot of people in this downstairs conference room. But right now, as you go down and you get out a tape measure and you think about what 6 feet really is, and you begin to set it up, we've set 8 people as the maximum for that room. You really could probably do 12 safely. We've got some high chairs that sit behind, but I don't know that we have a need for that. And the sign right on the door goes back to best practice. In addition to being functional and telling people no more than 8, is a reminder that, hey, we're in a different world and we're living by different guidelines. Whereas just 8 weeks ago, we would all bop down the stairs on a moment's notice and sat at all those tables together. And we're a long way away from doing that. So I think really thinking about your environment and thinking about the common areas, and a lot of employers have just said the common areas will be closed. I think the positive news right now is the weather is finally changing. And so if we need to take a break outside, that's easier said than done today than it was a month ago for sure, or limiting the number of people in a cafeteria, in a conference room. There's just a lot of, and I know people have thought about this. I think for us, where our mindset has changed and shifted and it's become real, is as we actually go into that space and we actually measure it off. So here's our upstairs conference room, just as an example. That's an 8-foot table, and you can see, you can't see the third blue X there, but we've actually taped it off. If you really want to observe a 6-foot social distance guideline, you got 3 people that can sit in there closely, right? So 3 people, whereas there are 8 chairs, we've pushed them back that would typically be in there. Now, I would mention here, 6 feet is the social distance guide. And later I'm going to mention a resource, which is, and I'm sure some people have seen this, Lear has put out their return to work playbook, and it's a great, they're on their 2nd iteration that came out yesterday. Mike Cosgrove and I were talking about that. It was 60 pages last week, and the 2nd version is now like 85 pages. So it's grown just over the course of a week. But they specifically mention in there that in the workplace, 3 to 6 feet is a more common distance that we see when people are working close by. And the point there isn't to say, hey, just drop it to 3 feet, but just understand that 6 feet is the social distance guideline for people outside of our household. But at work, that may not always be practical. And so it just changes our precautions within that. So again, just going back, I think, to the worker and workplace assessment, as you think about bringing people back, think about the physical space, think about barriers or signage, X's on the floor. I think we've all seen at some of the retail establishments, as the line is waiting outside, there are literally X's on the floor. And I think the reason for that is our experience with most people is that as they begin to line up or as they begin to talk to each other, we all have a tendency to come forward versus step back. And I think anything we can do to create a physical space reminder will help, and it'll help your employees as we get into that. So just bear with me as I drop down here. So again, thinking about a phased approach, you don't have to go all at once. You certainly want to think about your different types of workers and the precautions. And I would mention here that one of the big challenges for a lot of us as it relates to COVID and the pandemic response is that there is a disparity across different positions and employee types and employee pools. And so as managers and leaders, and certainly as HR people, we strive for consistency. And I don't want to say that's chucked out the window right now, but certainly at this point, we can't get consistent with all different types of workers. And so FAIR isn't always consistent. And I mentioned that in that some workers have a naturally higher exposure level than some of your other workers. And there's not a ton we can do about that. We can try to prevent it. Some people can work from home more effectively, and so they may not come back to the office for 2 or 4 weeks past when other people do. And some employees may say, well, that's not fair. And that may be true, but that's the world that we're living in. And so we strive for that consistency, but we can't always get there. This next piece is really around employee and visitor screening. And I think all of this stuff is important, but this is probably the most critical piece is as we look at how do we build a routine, meaningful practice around employees screening for symptoms, as I cough, of course, and visitors screening for symptoms. And so some counties, like Oakland County, as we go back, for any of our people on the webinar that have Oakland County locations, as we go back, they required this screening, and so did Wayne County very early on. In Livingston County, we haven't had it. Washtenaw had a different model. But our recommendation to 100% of businesses is employee screening for symptoms every single day with no exceptions when they're reporting in physically. This can be a self-assessment, and that's likely the best practice, right? But every single day. And you can see here what we've built is just an Excel sheet that could be filled out physically or can be filled out electronically and emailed in every single day is a great way to go. Someone saves it on their phone. We can create an email format or a Word format or Excel, and they forward it every single day to the designated administrator. And so no exceptions. And we do that because we want to build a practice around people really thinking about their body temperature, thinking about their symptoms. And I'll just tell a quick story. So, and I mentioned this here, do not assume that people will not report into work if they're symptomatic. This document says right on it, if you check yes to any of these, do not report into work, right? It says it right on it. Go back to a week ago Friday, client employee sent it in, 6:55 in the morning, cough and sore throat. He reports into a job site that he's the supervisor on. There aren't a lot of other workers there. He's predominantly working on his own, but the administrator comes in. She comes in at 8 o'clock. She reviews all of these and scans them. She sees a yes. She immediately reaches out to him and says, you've got to leave the site immediately. You checked yes. He says, it's seasonal allergies. And she said, and a lot of us experience seasonal allergies. And she said, but you checked yes here, and it says you can't report in. And specifically, the county has said in Oakland County, but depending on where we are, and the best practice from the CDC says, if you check yes, don't report in. So we decided to monitor his symptoms to see if they were consistent with seasonal allergies over the course of the next week. As of the middle of last week, symptoms had worsened. He had a test on Thursday as the symptoms continued to worsen. And yesterday he tested negative, but the doctor who was in the Beaumont system told him that he was 99% confident that it was a false negative, that he had COVID and had tested negative. And so the data, again, I'm not the expert on this, but the data certainly shows a plus or minus 8% on false negatives. And with instant test, it's showing 15%. So that means for any 100 people, if between 8 and 15 could have it and test negative. And so he'll have a retest this coming Thursday, which will be 13 days from onset of symptoms. But it's just an example. We can't just assume that people will not report in. In addition to having them submit these or fill these out, somebody needs to actually look at them, right, and understand that what they're writing. So I think this form can be identically used for visitors. Again, now this would apply to office environments. It's not going to apply to businesses that have the general public walking in all day for food service, for fitting of shoes, for curbside to go. As we begin to open those up, we can't ask every customer to come in. I think it's different here at Ecto or an office, a law firm or other office environments. So when you're dealing with general public, I think there's a different approach, but certainly for your own employees, screening every single day and building a process that's meaningful yet still easy. We don't want a pencil whip. We don't want to automatically have people just sending in the same form without having to push anything or write anything. I think we want interaction on the form every day, but we still want to make it easy, and then we want to centralize it to a specific person, right? You'll notice at the bottom here, there's information about if someone becomes symptomatic as well, and we can send this form out, but what that allows is then that designated person, if they become symptomatic, they get sent home. And then that person who's your administrator or your designated, might be you as the business owner, can then call and have a conversation about what part of the facility did you enter and use? Did you use bathrooms? Tough conversations like that, right? Were you close contact with any other employees? Who's potentially at risk? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But obviously super critical on the employee and visitor screening. As it relates to visitors, I would mention as well, maintaining a visitor log. Again, this is for businesses that aren't having the general public walk in all day. Maintaining a visitor log so that if someone comes in for a meeting and you do have an in-person meeting and you later find out a staff person is sick, that you can communicate back and do some limited contact tracing. So jumping in here and looking at looking specifically at the PPE that's required, the personal protective equipment. Again, this is a change that's happened just in the last week. And this language you see here is pulled specifically from the executive order, right? So, and we've clearly defined here, so any individual able to medically tolerate a face covering must wear a covering over his or her nose and mouth when in any enclosed public space. Now, our office, for example, that's a private office, would not be defined as a public space. But if it's a public space, like a restaurant, like a retail environment, where people can come in and out of the door, we would interpret that to be a public space, and so people should have masks. And then all businesses are required to provide them. And the non-medical grade, again, right, we've been instructed not to deplete the medical grade mask supply. So what are we left with? Cloth coverings. There are a lot of options in the market now, and potentially, or homemade cloth coverings, which, and I would just show here, my niece has been making these. I think the only downside that I can see is if I don't put a little bit of tissue here, they fog my glasses. And then they also make my fairly large ears stick out, but that's the only downside. Once I get over that, I'm totally comfortable. Who knows how effective, again, but if I sneeze in this, the people around me are going to be much more comfortable than if I'm not wearing it, for sure, right? If you're in a plant environment, for example, a manufacturing environment, and you're going to have 60 or 80 workers coming in a designated door, and you've decided you're going to actually do temperature, use a thermometer to do temperature assessments, we're going to recommend full safety glasses and mask or a shield, because those people are going to be in really close contact with people all day long, right? My wife, who's an optometrist, will be wearing a mask and she'll be wearing glasses for sure, right? Hand sanitizer, this goes without saying, of course, but the one thing I think we've learned, we use the 2 James kind, but as you can see here, the great thing about this is it's very liquidy, if you can see that. And the positive of that is it translates to a spray bottle really well. So we buy it and we transfer it into 4-ounce spray bottles because it works for our hands and it works for surfaces at 80%. So I think providing that. And the last note I'd mention here are gloves. And there's some debate about this, but I think the general consensus now is that gloves actually create more risk than less. And so they should only be worn in certain applications. If it's food service, if someone is engaged in doing disinfecting or cleaning, they should wear gloves. If they're doing the temperature checking and the symptom screening, they should wear gloves. But as a broad policy, gloves have not been indicated to help in this case. So we've got just quickly here on cleaning and disinfecting. All of you are probably better at this than we are. I would just mention that the concept about everybody disinfecting something after they use it, if it's the copier or a shared piece of equipment, is great, and we strive for that. But the best practice is if you approach a shared piece of equipment, that you disinfect it before you use it as a fail-safe versus letting trusting that the last person did. And then I think designating someone who's primarily responsible. To say everybody's responsible is great, but really, how frequently do you want to disinfect? How frequently do you want to disinfect high-touch surfaces, and what can you actually live with? Let's not say we're going to disinfect them every 30 minutes, but we're going to disinfect once in the morning, once at lunch, and once in the afternoon. I think if you are a retail or a restaurant, coffee shop, I think we've certainly seen where people are attracted to places that are cleaner or are taking it seriously. I went into a business, I won't name them, about 9 days ago, and it appeared they were taking zero precaution whatsoever. And I just haven't been back in that regard. And so I think it's a marketing thing as well. I mentioned the bleach thing here only because this is a reference point to go back to the CDC. The CDC is providing us with great resources, and why would we reinvent things if they've already given this? And so when employees ask us questions about how and why we decided to use a bleach solution or alcohol, or how and why we decided to provide cloth-based masks, we can point back to the governor's order and the CDC and saying we are doing our best to observe the best guidelines and the experts' guidelines. And so that's what, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. That's what we're doing. So a couple other things to think about. Certainly this restriction against non-essential travel, and the point I mentioned for employers here is this extends to personal travel as well. Certainly if someone decides, and they might have to travel for a funeral or an estate issue or a personal matter or something else. But if someone from your team flies domestically or internationally, you do have the ability to restrict them from returning to your workplace, right? And there's some best practice around that. It's not just about restricting non-essential travel for business, which we still think is a great idea, and is the best, the best practice. So, and people may say, well, you can't legislate my life and stop me from going on vacation. And of course, none of us want to do that. We never wanted to be in this position. But I certainly can set a policy that says you cannot return here until a certain amount of time has passed, like 14 days. So stressing personal and team accountability. To get people really comfortable, we've got to show them our good faith efforts and our best practices. We need to have sanitizer. There's breweries and distilleries are making it now. It's more widely available. Masks in whatever form, signage. We need to show them we're taking it seriously, but they need to have their own personal responsibility and team accountability. And this really speaks to the person who might be a COVID denier, or maybe much more lax, or maybe they just have a higher tolerance for risk, or they're a 24-year-old young dude who thinks they're bulletproof, right? And nothing's going to happen to them. It's not really about them, and we need to stress that it's about keeping their team safe. And so we always hit back on that. One of the questions we have later is about, that came up, someone sent over, is about if we know someone has a known health condition, can we ask them about that, or should we stop them from coming in? And I think you have to allow people to make some of their own decisions about whether they're healthy enough and want to return to work. And so without wading into health conditions, a question you might just ask somebody, which I feel like you should ask almost everybody, is, are you comfortable returning to work? And we know that in a large environment, you personally can't ask every single person, but you can train your frontline managers, your production supervisors, your foremen to ask a couple of simple questions. How are you feeling about getting back to work? What's been your experience? How's your family doing since we've been back at this full bore and here every day, right? What are you worried about right now? What's your biggest fear or concern, right? We put this no handshake, it's just a gimmicky, stupid little sign, but it sets a tone, right? It's on the front of our desk here, and it just sets a tone for people as a reminder. And I don't know who else has experienced this, but I've experienced a couple situations where we're out walking in the neighborhood, or we're out here and we bump into someone and they still come right into our personal space right away. And it's like yelling the word space or back up or putting our hand up, but I think anything we can create that sets a tone and a boundary for people. Again, hand washing policies. These were always in every bathroom of every restaurant, coffee shop, every place we went, but they weren't always in all generalized bathrooms, and they really should be. And so let's set a tone for that as well. I think employers just have to expect more absenteeism. They have to expect more requests to work from home. They have to expect more flex requests. And I think employers have to probably adjust to this regardless of environment. For a long time, we've really struggled, especially in construction or manufacturing environments where shifts start at 6 a.m. and they end at 4 p.m. and you've got to have a certain number. And I know those are all realities, right? Those are all realities. But I think what we've seen is that employers probably need to consider suspending a portion of their point system for attendance for a period of time, right? Or refreshing everybody. Because if we have the same rules we had 8 weeks ago when school was in full session and people were really only worried about before and after school care, when both parents might have been, one parent may not have been working, any of that, I think it's just different. And I think we have to anticipate and request those. And I would say this is just our general advice. It's just be more flexible. I don't think you have a choice. I think to retain workers, we're going to have to be more flexible, and we're going to have to assume that people are honest and want to work. We get a lot of questions and calls about people are, I'm going to talk about this in a minute. People are going to want to stay home because they make more on unemployment than they will coming to work. That's not really true. There's a small subset of people for whom they will want to stay home because they make more, right? But the large majority of people, and we know this based on the anecdotal and the specific evidence we've seen with our clients that have continued to work, right, or have recalled people already, is that people are willing to come back and have wanted to come back. People have really, employees have pulled together most often. So, and just remember, you've got paid sick leave and paid family leave under FFCRA available to you. Not only available, you're required to use it. And so this leads us into when employees get sick, how do we respond and how do we make them feel comfortable to make the right decision, which means that their paycheck and their job isn't on the line to make a decision to stay home if they have symptoms, or to not come in if their spouse is experiencing COVID-like symptoms in their immediate house, and they could still be contagious and not be symptomatic, your employee. And so let's make sure that we don't put them in a position of having to choose between their job, right? And that's what all this legislation's been about, is not making people choose. So kind of last couple things here before we go into Q&A. If and when an employee gets sick, you obviously have to respond quickly. The catch here, as we mentioned, communicate quickly, but only after the facts are known. We've had multiple experiences where there's all this information out. Oh, so-and-so sick, and just yesterday he was with 3 people who were tested positive for COVID. And actually what we found is they had mixed up the 2 different employees, and the employee who'd been exposed hadn't been back to work in a couple of weeks. So let's get our facts straight. And once we have our facts straight, let's not wait to communicate to our team, because we've seen this. Your team, if someone at work leaves symptomatic, your team is talking about it, thinking about it, worrying about it. They're talking with their spouse. And so let's act quickly. The one situation we had, and Randy on our team dealt with it the most, we had a client, it was the end of the week 4 weeks ago, where someone became symptomatic at work and didn't leave probably quick enough, and kind of took the approach of, I kind of feel fine. And his coworker was like, you're probably fine, dude. And by the next day, another coworker felt sick, and that was Thursday afternoon. And they could have shut that facility and cleaned it on Friday and lost 1 day's revenue. Wouldn't have been a huge issue. And they didn't do that. And they ended up with multiple positive and a couple likely positives. And what happened after that is that the workforce was really apprehensive about coming back, and it had a much bigger impact than it would have been had they hit a 12-hour pause on their business and just temporarily shut the door, right? So certainly you've got to contact local health officials, and then do some limited contact tracing, which goes back to that form right on the bottom, fill that out. And I think this also ties into another best practice, which would be around, if you're holding in-person meetings, again, you can't do this with the general public, but having a shift log or an in-person meeting log or something that shows you who was working close by that person. If you know who was working on that shift, we can mention to those people that they really need to pay really specific attention. We might give them at that point a paid day off or 2 days off just to be safe. And again, remember, through the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act, that we've got to provide people with 10 days of paid sick leave at full pay if they have COVID or COVID-like symptoms and are pursuing a diagnosis. We've got to provide up to 12 total weeks, the 2 weeks plus 10 for people whose kids can't go to daycare or aren't in school at 2/3 of pay. And so we've got these things available, and we're getting a dollar for dollar federal credit on those things. And so, yes, it's kind of a pain to administer them and all that, but not only should we, but we're going to get the money back, and we get it back as a tax credit. So let's just do that, and let's not create extra stress or extra concern. Last point on this, if you have an issue, because there's a lot of debate, and I think versus looking at our slide, going to the CDC page, which this is pulled directly from, is when do I get to return if I had it or I think I had it? And what we've seen from employees, and it comes from a good spot, is they feel fine and they want to come back sooner, but they can't, right? And it tells us this right here. It's whichever is later. So if I'm ill today and tomorrow I feel perfect and I feel perfect for 6 more days, I cannot come back for 7 days from onset, right? Now, if I were sick for a full week and then I started to feel good, then we're talking about 72 hours from no fever, right? But it's whichever is later. I can't be sick for 2 days and then come back 3 days later. It's got to be 7 days from onset, right? And this is very clear. This is from the CDC's page. Again, this isn't Ecto's information. And so that's one really key point I'd mention is I would direct all of you to the CDC and to some of these other WHO, right? Because they've got the best practice, and let's not try to recreate it. Quick note here is we were going to publish something that was from the Allergy and Asthma Foundation, and it showed symptoms of seasonal allergies and symptoms of COVID and the flu. And as our team did more research and looked at the CDC's guide and this guide and some other illness foundations, they were in conflict with each other. So we decided not to use them because it wasn't from the leading organization. So last piece here before I wrap up, because we're going to butt up against the timing, is we've had a lot of questions about how do I get employees back to work? And so I would just encourage you to provide as much notice as possible. If you think you're in construction and you think you're going to get released a week from now, let people know that you think we're going to be released. If you think it's May 15th, and you want to plan for that, tell people now. Childcare has never been harder to find, right? People are just stressed to the max, right? Make an assumption people want to return, but if they can't or won't, be flexible. Could you come back 2 weeks from now? Would you consider, as we get 2 weeks into our first phase, if we reach out to you versus saying, well, then I don't want you anymore, because we're going to need people, right? We're still going to compete for people in the long run. 25 million may be unemployed today. That won't continue if we get the economy back in earnest, right? Remember, one of the questions we had was around what's the incentive for people to return? So the max rate for unemployment is $362 a week in the state. And then the feds have added federal pandemic unemployment compensation of $600 a week. And that $600 hinges only on an if-then. And that if-then is if that person, that worker is eligible for $1 of state unemployment compensation in a week, they're eligible for that $600. And so the key point here is if you're worried about bringing someone back because you're jeopardizing their entire unemployment, you can bring people back on partial reemployment. So at $962, $362 for the state and $600 from the feds, that's $24 an hour. That's a really high number. If someone makes $20 an hour and they typically work 40 hours a week, that's $800. If I can bring them back at 20 hours a week, they're going to get $400 from us. They're going to get a reduced state unemployment number, but they haven't maxed out of getting those benefits from the state. They're still going to get $150 or $200 from the state of Michigan, and they're still eligible for the $600 from the feds. So there is an incentive to return to work because they're going to make more. And I think employers just need to talk them through that process. And if that's not clear to you and you want to call and we can talk you through that, we'd be glad to do that. Just remember again, in order to be eligible for the extra $600 from the feds through July 31st, I simply need to be able to receive $1 of state unemployment in that week. And I'm ineligible for state unemployment at 1.5 times my weekly benefit. So if I'm a max rate employee, $362 a week is my state benefit. I don't earn out of unemployment in a week until I hit $540. Okay. If I were receiving $100 a week because I'm a part-time employee from the state, I don't earn out of state unemployment for that week until I make $150. So 1.5 times. Hopefully that makes sense. But just remember, partial reemployment, reduced hours is a great tool to use right now. We still get to take advantage of this federal compensation. We still get to use, and we're not taking advantage of it in a negative way. That's what it's there for, is for underemployment. And it allows us to phase into getting people back. We don't have to say 40 hours or nothing. We could say 20 hours or 30 hours or limited shifts. Last point here is if you're calling people back and trying to recall them and they're not responding, follow up in writing. And it's up to you how you want to handle this, right? But you could simply send a letter that says your position's available, we're ready for you to return to work, and we want you to return to work. And by the way, failing to return to your position jeopardizes your unemployment benefits in the state of Michigan. I don't know that the state's actually going to deny anyone. I don't know that any employer should really chase this down at this point, but just that language is a good way to mention to people and hopefully encourage the last few stragglers. But frankly, we haven't seen as much of that as we expected. So with that, I would just say kind of last points as we think about, there's so many moving pieces. You know, we didn't even touch on the Paycheck Protection Program, and we didn't touch on all of the unemployment stuff. And some of this is basic, but really what we're left with and we have to really think about is and we all can picture that Venn diagram of how do I keep my employees safe, right? While allowing them to earn a decent living while keeping my business operational. And that middle spot is really hard for us, harder than it's ever been. But I think really being creative and thinking specifically about your groups of employees and your employees. Don't necessarily listen to everything out there about all these other groups. Think about your own environment, your own workspace, your own worker types, and craft a plan that works for you and for them and communicate with them and get their feedback about that. And I think you'll find that we really can make this work. And hopefully what we'll see as cases continue to decrease and we'll get a little more open, we can move into phase 2 and ultimately hopefully phase 3, where we're all at, you know, the Smoke and Jazz and Blues Festival at some point, where we're all engaged in chamber webinars that aren't webinars and are in person again, and we all enjoy that. So with that, I'll shut up and turn it over to Janelle for a little bit of Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. I think you helped to really give us a little bit of guidance and answer some of our questions and provide a little bit more clarity as we chart our path back to business here. So we'll open it up for Q&A. I did mention earlier that I was going to start with some of the questions that we've received previously, and I'm going to start here with a question from Richard Lim, who has a residential studio that he uses for taking headshots. And I know that we covered a lot of the precautions that he needs to implement to protect his clients and families should he decide to reopen that studio. So I didn't know if there was anything that you wanted to add to that, Steve. I think that we kind of covered some of that.
We did cover. I would just think about if I'm able to, treating it, if it's a home studio or home office, is I think designated entry point is really good. Obviously, we can't take pictures with masks, but treating those people, having them do a screening, it may be a little awkward, but even to send it to them in advance of that booking and say, you know, prior to coming, would you please complete this on the day just to make sure that, you know, I want to keep my family safe. And so just thinking about having it, treating it just like any other workspace and following the best practices to the extent you can, for sure.
Okay, and then we had another question from Uptown Coffee House about employees returning back to work and they're making more money on unemployment, but I also think you kind of touched on that towards the tail end there. So even if they were open to maybe doing some part-time work, that they could still collect one of those benefits.
Yeah, and that 1.5 times the weekly benefit. So understanding from an employee what their weekly benefit was. If it's 100, then the employee can't earn more than 150, but there could be a sweet spot in there. And again, that's what it was designed for. That's not a gimmick. That's what the 600 was designed for, and we can take advantage of that and still hopefully get back to work, right? It's more money for them. The lie we tell ourselves is if I work, I make less on unemployment. Right now, that's not really true, right? So.
Okay, so this is a more specific question. If a staff has a pre-existing condition like asthma, do they need a doctor's note before they can return to work? And then is there any liability for the organization?
We never say there's no liability, but again, with all of this is we're doing our good faith efforts and we have to think about liability. But if we spent a lot of our time worrying about the potential downstream legal aspects of employing people right now, none of us would open our business at all, frankly. There is some OSHA guidance about whether workers' comp will cover, and it will cover if there's a known outbreak at work. But as it relates to pre-existing conditions, again, I would go back to questions about how do you feel about returning to work? Are you comfortable versus I know you have asthma or diabetes. Are you sure you want to return? And then I wouldn't ask anyone for a doctor's note, because I think everyone's got the same responsibilities, personal responsibility. And if I didn't require them to provide a doctor's note to work for me a month ago or 3 months ago, I wouldn't start doing that now. I think that's too much projection onto them for their health conditions. Allow them to make their own decision about returning.
Great, thank you. This one's from Sandy Cortez. It says, when bringing employees back to work, they still get employed. Okay, no, we already talked about that one. I believe we answered that. It was unemployment question. So then we have another one here that says, can you please share these in other forms as well as the slides?
Absolutely. We'll send out the PowerPoint as well as the worker screening forms. We'll probably attach a couple of our goofy signs that you have that just have some notes on them that we're using in the no handshake. So we'll put a packet together and either upload it, but we'll work with Janelle, Pam, and everybody just to make it available regardless of chamber. So
Thank you so much. We appreciate that. It'll be very helpful. And then somebody asked where you find your hand sanitizer.
So we use two, James. Full disclosure, Eric Lorden, my business partner's husband, is the lead distiller there. So normally he's handing out vodka and whiskey, but they switched their entire line. It's a pretty cool story over to sanitizer. It's a little pricey. They're in Detroit and they've got it available. We have a business that's working with Atwater. I'm not touting these, but we have a construction client that's getting theirs from Atwater. So if you're local and you want me to put you in touch with the person who gets it, let us know. I've had this bottle specifically, as you look, it's about an inch gone. I've been in the office 3 days a week by myself, but I've had this bottle for probably 4 weeks. This stuff it does go a long way. Do not drink it. It's not the alcohol that'll kill you, it's the other stuff. And they have had someone report in that they drank it.
Thanks. Oh boy. Thanks for the disclaimer there. If somebody travels by their own choice and we say that you cannot return to work, do we need to grant them additional sick leave for that self-quarantine?
No.
Or, okay, do they need to use their own leave in their time bank?
That's up to you. I mean, I think technically it would apply as an FMLA leave, meaning there's some job protection there. They can or should be able to use their paid leave. Whether you require them to or not is up to you. That's where you get really specific and nuanced. But if someone chooses to travel, if they're on the Florida beaches right now with a bunch of other people and they come back and you're not comfortable having them return for that reason, and that's outside best practice, you do not have to pay them or grant them leave. Now, I think the reasons matter, and that's why consistent and fair aren't always the same. There are people that have had to travel to deal with elderly parents or other reason, and they may not have a choice. It doesn't mean I pay one or pay the other. I'm just not likely to be punitive in terms of job loss or termination or discipline.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is case specific about an employee who maybe has a fever and then tests negative, I'm assuming for the virus, and then 3 days later they are fever free. At what point is it okay for them to return to work? Was your suggestion 7 days?
7 days from onset. So again, if I'm feverish today, fine tomorrow, right? I would not be eligible to return for 7 days from the date of onset, right? 72 hours, no fever, or 7 days from the onset of symptoms, whichever's later. And I would just stress, because we've all had this tug of like, well, it probably is seasonal allergies, or probably, I can tell you, I almost mentioned the client's name in the one specific case, it absolutely wasn't seasonal allergies. And had we allowed this guy to go unchecked, he would have infected a whole job site walking around, right? And so my wife said to me, who would ever come in with a fever right now? Well, there are some knuckleheads out there for whatever reason. That's a sign of, maybe they think it's a sign of toughness. I don't know. We've got a great thing we send out as well. Maybe we'll include that says, thank you so much for showing your dedication to our company by infecting all our coworkers with your illness, right? And it's just kind of to put a joke on it, but we don't want that. I hope that part of business and employee attribute of macho, I come in when sick, I hope that's gone forever. I don't believe it will be, but I hope that it is.
I have another question here. It says, just to clarify, can your employees be collecting partial unemployment benefits while you are using PPP funds to cover the hours they are working?
100%. Yeah, there's no conflict. And so I would just, and I don't want to hold myself out as an SBA expert or a PPP person. I've read a lot, but I did spend a great part of the week, not a great part of the weekend, part of Sunday and a little bit Monday, reading the actual interim rule. And if you go to Department of Treasury, they have an FAQ right now on the PPP, and they've also got the interim rule posted. and you can really see what their definition. If that person wants to email me direct, I'll email you exactly what I've extracted from there. There aren't any limitations on that outside. It defines compensation very plainly and very broadly. So you can absolutely. What you can't, just a quick note, if you've set up a formal work share program with the state of Michigan, and I don't know why anyone would have or has, I don't know anyone that has in this environment, the people may not be eligible for that extra 600. That gets really technical. If you're in that position, again, just reach out to us. We'll be glad to talk through it. And I think as a general concept, we can't provide a ton of advice to everybody for free, but within reason, if you want to reach out and we can answer things over 10 or 15 minutes, we'd be glad to do that.
Appreciate that. Thank you. All right. And then can we require workers to get a test before they physically returned to the office to work? All of our office workers are able to do work remotely. Can we ask them to share test results?
So the best practice, and so far, and I haven't seen if this has changed yet, but the original guidance from the CDC was that we not require a doctor's or test results because of the limitation on testing. And I don't know if that's changed in the last week because testing centers have expanded. We're going to see them in pharmacy parking lots potentially here at Broader. There's only about 70 of them so far nationwide. So if they had COVID-like symptoms and have been out for a period of time, then I would, and there's reason, and they can get a test, I would encourage them to contact their doctor and see if they qualify for a test. But in at least half the cases, the doctor have said, no test. We're not going to test you because you don't meet these other risk factors. Stay at home, isolate, follow this 7 days or 72 hours since last symptom. And I would not require it. There is, if we go back just quickly here, if you had a positive test, you've got to get 2 negatives right at a certain point. And that's what the CDC guideline is here. But in the absence of a positive test, I would not require testing as a general rule.
Awesome. Thank you. We have one last question here. FMLA applies to all size businesses, 50 or less employees.
Thinking about the FFs, I'm just going to relate this to the FFCRA portion of, so the FMLA only applies to employers with 50 or more in a 75-mile radius. The Families First Coronavirus Relief Act provided an emergency expanded FMLA. And there is a carve out to claim hardship for employers with less than 50 if it would create a hardship. I don't know that that's a really great argument or something I would recommend you go down that path, because you get a dollar for dollar federal tax credit and you actually offset your deposits to the Fed. So if you, let's just say someone makes $100 per day and their kids are out of school and they can't work. And so you would need to give them 2/3 under that expanded FMLA. So $67 per day. At the end of a week, they would have made $335. When you process your payroll, you are literally going to offset all of your withholding and all of your FICA by that amount. And so the lag on getting your money back, unless you have a whole bunch of people on it, a whole ton of them, is really short. So I think it's a very limited window where an employer can and should make a hardship case to not provide that to employees. It's the federal money. That's what it was designed for. It's there. It's a little technical in how we track it, but I would take advantage of it if you can. But general FMLA is still 50 or more, just this expanded part under Families First. Again, really technical at that point. Almost too technical for my nerd HR brain too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate you joining us today and sharing your expertise so we can start creating some of our plans as we look to re-engage in business and move forward here post COVID-19. So thank you again. Thank you, Katie, Pam, Marcia, for collaborating on this. These have been absolutely wonderful. We're getting a lot of positive feedback from all of our members in our area. And what we're looking forward to is a couple other multi-chamber events as we come up here. We have one later this week on Thursday. Again, getting back to business with the health department. That's going to be the Livingston County Health Department Medical Director, Dr. Juan Luis Marquez, as he shares the safe practices, rules, and regulations when returning to work. So make sure that you become registered for that one to receive your login credentials. And then we'll also have an update from our fire and safety on May 5th. So Cinco de Mayo, join us on May 5th. And hopefully, you know, if as more information comes out, we'll look to collaborate and do joint efforts where we can. So thank you all. And again, thank you so much to Steve and HR for sharing your expertise. And we look forward to seeing you on Thursday. So thanks, everybody. Have a great week.
Thanks, everybody.